Welcome to the Liberty Show, where we talk about American classical education and invite you into the work of improving the moral and intellectual character of the next generation. I'm Matthew Kirby. I'm the CEO of Liberty Classical Schools, and our mission is to launch and support K-12 American classical charter schools that emphasize virtuous living, traditional learning, and civic responsibility. You can read more about us at libertyclassicalschools.org. Today, my guest is Dr. Shilo Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a professor of practice in the Department of Political Science at SMU, Southern Methodist University. He's the CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center on the SMU campus. He was previously executive director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, where he taught in the Department of Politics. Dr. Brooks is host of the Free Press podcast called Old School, and he's the author of a forthcoming book on the topic of noble ambition, which we're going to discuss in our conversation. He also publishes academic and scholarly work on politics and the humanities. He's lectured on topics related to statesmanship, civic leadership, American political thought, the history of political philosophy, liberal education, and the ethics of science and technology, and the ramifications of technology on our democratic society. He was born and raised in West Texas. He received a PhD in political science from Boston College and his BA in liberal arts from the Great Books program at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. He is married and has a daughter, and I am so excited for you to get to hear my conversation with Dr. Shilo Brooks. Dr. Shilo Brooks, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. It's a delight to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, sounds like you're just back in town after a trip to New York. I'm wondering, are you teaching this semester? And if so, what's on your plate for the remainder of the year?
You know, I'm not teaching this semester. I've just become the president and CEO of the Bush Center in September, and I am on the faculty at SMU, but I told the department that I probably needed to make sure that I understood how the Bush Center works before I re-engage with teaching. So I'm teaching through my podcast, Old School, but other than that, I'm not in the classroom this coming semester.
Well, that sounds like an incredible opportunity and pretty awesome that the university's making that possible for you, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm real grateful to him.
That's great. Well, let me share with you just a little bit about how I came to know about you and why I think it's awesome that we're talking. So we lead a network of schools in Georgia. We've got 3 American classical charter schools, and our ambition is to continue to plant these things over time. And we think about our goal as being to improve the moral and intellectual character of the next generation. And we do that in these American classical schools. And what we mean by that is that these schools are organized to cultivate or develop the moral and intellectual character of students, obviously to ground them in our common heritage, to train their affections towards goodness and truth and beauty, to imbue them with a sense of public spiritedness, and then ultimately to prepare them to build happy lives full of meaning and purpose. And so that's our MO and our business plan. And I heard about you originally from the Honestly podcast produced by Barry Weiss. And the title of it was so evocative to me, Can Reading Fix Men? And man, I saw that title and just wanted to jump right in. I had a sense that you're going to have things to say that would be interesting to me and interesting to all of our teachers and our students and their families. And you might be happy to know that outside the office of our head of school of our flagship school, Atlanta Classical Academy, there's a large sign on the wall. It's a quote from the mother of our head of school. And the sign on the wall there says that the books that we read and the people with whom we read them will determine the direction and the quality of our lives. And so that's kind of our point of view of things. And so hopefully we'll find great things that resonate with one another.
I think so.
Yeah. So I was going to get you to start, if you would, tell our audience a little bit about your story. I'm particularly interested how your youth and your upbringing led you to St. John's College, which is directly across King George Street from my alma mater, the U.S. Naval Academy.
Oh, yeah.
But I'd like to hear about that story.
Sure. I mean, I had a circuitous path. I grew up in a town called Lubbock, Texas, which is in West Texas. It's not the place people think of when they think of our state. They often think of Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. Was born in a real small town out there called Brownfield. And I had a good family, but I had a broken family in that I had a good mother who really had her head on her shoulders with respect to raising me and my brother. But she was, went through a lot of divorces, multiple, many. It's hard enough for a kid to go through one, much less, 4 or 5. And we never really had a lot. And, I was not a great student in school. But I love to read, and I especially would really light up when I got a hold of a book that was that adults told me was of some enduring value, whether that was a great American classic like Mark Twain's Huck Finn, or whether it was a book like Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov or Machiavelli's Prince. Those books that spoke to enduring, human questions really, were all I was interested in. So I floated around a little bit and graduated from high school. I went to a public school out there in Lubbock and never really thought about going to college. And you asked me, how did you get to St. John's? Well, I'd heard about St. John's 2 ways. One, that I had an English teacher who said, you don't do a lot of the work, and but you're smart and you read the books. When I assign the book, you'll read the book. You're not going to do your vocabulary exercises or whatever it is you're going to do, but you'll read the book. And she said, there's a college you can go to where that's all they do is read those books. And you don't even have to take any tests. You write essays and there's discussion classes, and that's all there is. And so I heard about St. John's and wrote for the literature. And when you get back in those days, when you got the literature for St. John's in the mail, it had this big book, and on the cover of it that tells you about the school, on the cover of it, I'll never forget it. It said, the following teachers will return to St. John's College next year: Plato, Aristotle, Jane Austen,
Love it,
Euclid, Shakespeare, and all these names just went on and on and on. And I had never thought about those people as teachers, that they could be my teachers. And so that's how I heard about St. John's, but I knew there was no way that I was going to be able to afford, that my mother and I would be able to afford going there. And I ended up enrolling in some local, state schools and these kinds of things. Regional schools, not what I would call the big state schools. And I just wasn't happy. And long story short, a man from my hometown heard that I love books, and heard that I was not going to be able to go to college because it just wasn't working out for me. I was about 20 years old. His daughter studied the classics at Baylor, and I would talk to her on the phone, and she said, I'm going to tell my dad you're not going to college. He's going to be worried. And so anyway, he called me on the phone and said, look, how do you think — he was a doctor, he's still around. He said, how do you think I got through medical school? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, somebody paid for me a little bit here and there and helped me along. And they told me, look, you don't have to pay me back. You just need to do it for somebody else someday. So he says, why don't you apply to St. John's? Which I was going to do anyway, because when you apply to St. John's, you get a free copy of Homer's Iliad. And I wanted the free copy of that Iliad when you get in. That's what you get. And so they sent me the Iliad. I got in. And he said, well, look, I know they're going to send you some financial aid papers. Since you got in, congratulations. Why don't you send me those papers? I want to look those over. And I sent him the financial aid documents. And he called me back and said, look, if you and your mother can have some skin in the game, maybe you all pay a few $100s a month, whatever y'all can afford. And you take out, some small amount of loans, because I want you to know that you're going to have to pay for this thing yourself a little bit. You got to have some skin in the game. I will pay the lion's share of your college tuition for the next 4 years to go to St. John's. And I'm telling you right now, he paid my tuition. I went to St. John's. I wrote him every month and told him what I was going to be doing. And that decision and his generosity are responsible for all that I am today.
Man, what an incredible story. Just briefly, an aside, I had a similar success in promoting our original school. We were doing presentations for the community and trying to generate excitement around a classical school in Atlanta. And I had a slide that I would sort of try to have a comedic or good timing moment. And I told the parents sitting in the audience, I want to introduce you to some of our teachers. And of course, they couldn't believe that we would have already hired teachers at this point, which of course we hadn't. But then I threw the images on the screen and did exactly what you're suggesting there. We had, Plato and Winston Churchill and Martin Luther King Jr. and, a lot of big, significant intellectual figures. And that to this day, I hear people tell me that moment was the moment when they said, yeah, I want my kids to have this kind of education. So it's a pretty powerful thought about all that we have to learn from those who've been there ahead of us. I wonder, Shilo, would you, at the risk of asking you to tell a story you've told, I was really captivated by your description. I believe it was maybe a stepfather of yours who I believe you sort of described as being not on the surface a man of letters, but nonetheless a man who really influenced you and encouraged you to read. I'm really interested in that. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I had a number of influences in my life. I mean, I mentioned to you a moment ago that one of the things I would do in school is read. And, that came to me because for a period of years, about a decade, my mother was married to a Vietnam vet who, with a high school education, who drove a forklift at the airport loading cargo onto airplanes by day. But at night, he would come home, and he was a man of some artistic, musical, and literary spirit, even though he himself did not go to any fancy school or have a kind of formal education after high school. And so he would sit down, he'd come home and we'd do the usual things in the backyard where we'd throw the football, and then dinner time would come, and he would, he was a manly man in a way that I didn't know that at the time. But what I mean by that is that, he worked hard, and he drove a forklift, and he could cook a steak, and he could shoot a bow and arrow. And to me as a boy, I mean, all that stuff was just awesome. But what he also did was he would sit down in the evenings and he'd read a book. And sometimes it would be a novel. He introduced me to Jack Kerouac and those kind of things. Sometimes it would be nonfiction. Sometimes he'd read National Geographic magazine. He got himself an acoustic guitar when he left the Navy, and he would sit and write music, and, like it was a poem, and he would read me the words of the songs, and then he'd play, put them to acoustic guitar music. And so just being around a man like that, because I think, I grew up in Texas and I love football, and I love all that stuff. But, I didn't see a lot of other guys around me at high school who were just loving to read. I mean, everybody wanted to play football, and that's great. And I wanted to play football. I'm not trying to get down on that at all. But to have this man in my life who had all those qualities, but who was also a kind of literary man, really set an example for me. And to this day, one of the things I think is really important is that, I get asked all the time, how do I make my children read more? Well, there's a lot of different ways. One of those ways is that you should read more. They should see you doing it. They should know that a well-lived life is a well-read life. And so that he really, really set an example for me.
Yeah, that's pretty great. So I wonder if we could get you to kind of share a working definition of a classical or liberal arts definition. There's a number of tangents and sects and flavors of classical education out there, but I wonder if you could sort of, in your mind, what is sort of the essence of what a classical liberal arts education is? Sure.
And I don't have a monopoly on this, and you're right. There's a lot of different ways of articulating it. And I mine has been shaped by my experience at St. John's and by my own teaching. But I would say, when we talk about the term liberal arts, that can mean a lot of different things. And I think when folks hear that today, a lot of people think, well, you must be writing poems and doing pottery. You're going to a liberal arts school or something like that. I've taught at those places, and that goes on, and I'm all for writing poetry and doing pottery. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. So when I hear liberal arts, I think first of liberty, of freedom, and what it means to engage in freedom. And I think a lot of the ways about this, of my own experience at St. John's, where I came to St. John's, which is a liberal arts school in the classical tradition, with convictions about the way the world worked. Maybe those convictions were true, maybe they were false. Some of them were religious, some of them were just political. I was 19, 20 years old. Some of them were artistic. This kind of writing is good, that one's bad. This music's good, that kind's bad. So I had this set of kind of what I thought were settled views. And then I encountered these books. And these books, and the authors of these books, posed a challenge to all the convictions that I had. They showed me some author, I grew up loving democracy, and here I am reading a critic of democracy. And I grew up, thinking a certain thing about Christianity, and here I am reading a critic of Christianity, and I grew up thinking, and so it was just everybody. It was just it was chaos in a way. What those books permitted me to do is to liberate myself from conviction, as mere prejudice, challenge those convictions, and try to see whether they stood the test of truth. Are they just convictions and prejudices, or are they truth? Can I argue with Plato? Can I test my own views against his? Are my arguments good enough to meet his? And so over the course of reading those books, what happened to me is that my mind was free. The things that I thought that I knew, I realized I didn't know. And I realized how much more I had to learn. And I realized how complicated the world is and how complex everything around us is. And I gradually began to feel free. And so when I think of the liberal arts, what they do is that they free the mind from its prison and encourage a deeper thought and a pursuit of truth that tests you. And we can talk about the classical definition of the liberal arts and all those sorts of things. But when I think about it and when I teach courses, that's what I think about.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Speaking of your own teaching and also just teaching in general, what do you think are the most important attributes or elements of a teacher?
Couple. So I think, some of them are obvious and some of them are less obvious. One is that I think you have to love the subject matter. And when I've had a lot of success teaching at great institutions, and one of the things that I think sustains me, and I get asked about it all the time, is I love these books. These books change my life, the books that I teach. It's not, as you know, because I've told the story, it wasn't just about going to get a credential, an education for me, to go and get a job. That's important and people need to be able to do that. But for me, I wasn't going to get to read these books. And then somebody introduced me to them and then I read them and it freed my mind and it allowed me to become all that I am today. And so I love these books. And I think a teacher has to love these books such that they would do it for free. And there have been times when I was paid basically nothing to teach. And I was fine with that. Those are some of the happiest days of my life. And I don't think I'm not trying to tell teachers they should do it for free, and certainly pay your teachers and pay them more. But what I'm saying is there are days when I get out of that classroom and I go home at night and I think, I can't even believe I get paid to do this. It's its own reward. And so I think that's important. The second thing that I want to say is a little bit unconventional, which is one thing that a teacher does is sets an example for the students of the kind of person that they're asking the students to be. So I am a liberal arts nerd in every way. I want to show myself to those students such that they see that the life that I'm encouraging them to live, the examined life, the life of curiosity, I'm living it. They can see what it means to live that life in me. And if you as a teacher don't hold yourself to the standard of calling your students to be liberally educated and don't model yourself what a liberal educated person is for them, then I think you're not doing it right yet. So I think you need to hold yourself to be the thing that you want your students to become and model that for them every day.
Yeah, really, really well said. That's awesome. What are you observing about your students at SMU, and not to call them out in particular, but I'm curious, sort of, in what ways are they responding to your teaching? And
I just got to SMU, so I haven't taught
all right.
any SMU students yet. I can answer the question though in this way. I did just teach at Princeton for the past number of years, and look, students are different everywhere. I had some of the best students in the world at Princeton. I can't believe, I just met one the other day in New York who graduated. They are extraordinary with what they do. I think that a lot of students are in a position where they get to college and they don't know like what a college education is supposed to do and be for you. Like, what am I doing here? Am I here to get a degree? Am I here to learn a trade? Am I here? And so I have students who come to me for advice and who came to me for advice at Princeton just about how to get a good education. And they were the smartest kids in the world. One of the things that I would tell them is, of course, you need to read deeply and you need to find classes. Of course, that will prepare you for the workforce, but you need to be sure to set aside some slice of your education for classes that train the heart, that move the heart, something you love. Don't lose sight of that. I know, and your parents are going to put pressure on you and, those sorts of things, but you have to find, there are general ed requirements. Take some good courses, ask your friends, talk about what good courses are here. I had students confess to me that they had never read a book in whole. Yep. This is Princeton University.
Princeton students, right.
They had read 1 or 2 books maybe total in their education as a whole. And when they got to my class, they'd read the books in full and come up to me and say, thank you. This is the first time that I have ever been able not just to read a book in full, but in my classes, we might focus on only 2 or 3 over the course of the semester versus the 20 or 30 that you might focus on in another class at college level. And they would say, thank you for having me read a book in full, and thank you for allowing me to read it slowly. And so, these kinds of things really move me about those kids. And I think there's a lot of pessimism about young people today. Maybe some of that is well placed. I think it's wrong-headed. These students understand a complex world. They've grown up in a complex world. People ask me a lot about students in technology, and their laptops are out and they're addicted to social media and all the things that you already know about people who are 18 to 24 years old. And I say, yes, but the thing that they knew that my generation didn't know was that this stuff is harmful, and they sense that there's an addictive property to it, and that it can harm them, and that they need to be moderate, and they're looking at it critically. And so, I'm hopeful, and I think kids are just as bright and just as ambitious as they've always been.
Yeah. Could you speak just a little bit? I'm sort of jealous for our audience to hear you speak about the unique benefit of books and reading, and maybe a really sound education for boys. I've got, a heart for young men that I perceive, as you're describing, many of them have not been led in this direction. And I guess I'm asking you to kind of make that case a little bit. Why is it uniquely important for boys and young men to be readers?
I think, as a young man, one of the things that you need a lot of different things. But one of the things that you need, and young women need this too, and it can come to them in different ways, and young men and women in different ways. Young women seem to read more and have a bit more sensitivity just by nature and disposition. Increasingly, young men don't read much. There's some statistics on this, and whether they read much in the past is up for debate. What I think you can get in particular, and the reason I've had some of these thoughts is that in my classes, a lot of the people were in there, and at Princeton, some of my classes got up to 275 people. A huge portion of those classes was men. That was bizarre. And by huge, I mean 50%. That was bizarre in a literature class, because if you walk into a literature class, a lot of the time, the majority of the enrollment is female. And so for me, teaching philosophy, great works of the past, that kind of thing, to have that percentage of men was astonishing. And I would have athletes in ROTC, and they'd come up and shake my hand and look me in the eye and say, thank you, sir. Thank you for having done that. And I kind of think, well, what is it about the men that's making this resonate? And what I think that what I got from reading all these books is I needed a kind of an emotional education. I needed an experience that I couldn't provide myself living in my narrow home in West Texas. I needed somebody to teach me what it meant to love and to love well. And I needed to read Jane Austen, and I needed to read Shakespeare, and I needed somebody to teach me what it meant to be free. And so I needed to read Frederick Douglass, and I needed somebody to teach me what justice was. And I needed somebody to make sense of my desire to be noble and courageous. And I needed to see men doing that in Thucydides and in Homer. And so I ended up getting this kind of emotional education through books. The other thing that I got that I think you can get is I saw examples of a life that I could lead, but that I wasn't leading. So if you read a great man like Lincoln or Churchill, or in my case, I fell in love with the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald and some of his depictions of what university life could be. And I just realized there's more out there than what I know, and I can become anything. Like I was working at the shopping mall when I was having, and there's nothing wrong with working at the shopping mall. I was 19 years old. You check people out at the cash register. But I started to see that I could do more than that because I was seeing that in these books. And I think young men in particular today lack a sense of purpose. There's been some criticisms of men, some of them well-placed, some of them misplaced, but they've grown up in an environment where a lot of times young men are not given the kind of proper developmental attention that they need. There are not many teachers who are men anymore, especially in English. There's a lot of research done on K-12 education, and the guy who noticed that I was a reader was a male English teacher, was introducing me to John Steinbeck and was introducing me to Ernest Hemingway. So I think a kind of sense of purpose is what I found. An emotional education is what I found. Curiosity is what I found. Civilization is what I found. How to be a father, how to treat a woman, what it meant to be a responsible human being, what it meant to be artistic and sensitive and strong were all things I found in books.
Yeah, amazing. I want to ask you to comment about volume a little bit. We just had a alumni event at the beginning of the week inviting recent graduates from our flagship school, some who are in college, some are maybe have just recently graduated. And, speaking with them, I'll ask questions like, well, how did your experience in college relate, or how was it alike or not alike your experience at Atlanta Classical Academy? And they'll say things like, well, we're reading pretty good stuff, but we're just going so fast as the volume is just crazy. And, I just kind of miss the days of the great conversations we used to have in high school. And I'm just curious, like, how do you think about that in terms of setting up your courses?
Yeah. So my course I taught a course at Princeton where the first year I had about 30 or 40 students, and I thought I was the biggest success in the world. And then the next year, 275 people enrolled in that course. And then I taught, and then I thought, well, that can't happen again. And I taught it the next year, and 275 people enrolled again. And so when I got to thinking about why is this thing successful, it really speaks to what you're saying about your students. One of the things that I did on this particular syllabus that was so successful, and what I do when I think about syllabi, is I think there should be a lot of experiences that students have educational at university. So you need a course that's going to ask you to read 100 books. You try it. I'm glad that's there, and you should put yourself through that. What I noticed is that there weren't many courses that were asking you to read one, or that were asking you to read 5. And so I wanted to make sure that in a Princeton student's education, there was an option to go and read a few books. Now, you find this around, I'm not saying I'm the only one, but there weren't as many as I would have liked. And so I started a course that had 5 books on the syllabus, which at that university is pretty unheard of. And I would say to the students at the beginning, I would rather you read a few great books well than many good or even mediocre books poorly. So what we're going to do is read a few books well rather than many books poorly. And so my hope is that some of these books you might hate. Good. That's good. It's an educational experience not to like a book, because then you need to tell me why, and we need to talk about that. I hope you find one that you love. I hope you find one that frustrates you and makes you mad. I hope you find one that makes you cry. I hope you find one that's hilarious. And so I would take 5, books max on any course I teach, really, and go very slowly through those books. A lot of reading aloud in the lecture course that I teach. I would have a reader. I mean, you got to imagine this. There's 250 or 275 undergraduates in the room. There's 19 teaching assistant sections that have to happen for this. I would have one of them mic'd up, and I would say, everybody, let's turn to page 45, read paragraph 32. And we'd read that thing aloud, and I would talk through it in this huge lecture hall with these kids as though it was a seminar. And it was the most moving thing. And I didn't do that because I planned that. I did that because that's how I learned at St. John's. And I was just taking it, and it's all I knew. And now there's 200 people. We're just going to keep doing it that way. And so that was what really resonated there. And it's just a principle that I've had my whole life. These books, some books, it's taken the author years to write. It took Montesquieu 20 years to write The Spirit of the Laws, one of the greatest books in political philosophy that's ever been written. It's a big book. We ought to give him the time that he put 20 years into that. We don't need to AI summarize that. We owe that man, some patience. So that kind of spirit.
Yeah. That's awesome. I wanted to shift the topic to the notion of meaning and purpose. And a book that's been very influential to me over time has been Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he has this assertion that our primary urge as human beings is not towards pleasure or towards power, but towards the pursuit of meaning and purpose. And I wonder, does that concept resonate with you? Is that something you think about?
It is something I think about, and it goes back to what I said about the reason I think men should read more, boys should read more, is that there's a search for that. And of course, girls are searching for that too. But I think young men in particular, when they don't have that, it's a little more dangerous. They're a little bit more dangerous than young women are who don't have that. And so I think, yes, that resonates with me. I saw a similar insight, felt a similar feeling when at St. John's, you read the books, the great books in chronological order. And when you get to the end in your senior year, you're up into the 19th century, 20th century. And one of the authors you read is Friedrich Nietzsche. And he, is an author who challenged all of my deepest convictions and who I went on to write a book on and all these kinds of things. But he makes, kind of similar observations about life. And I think it's true. The one thing I will say about that articulation of the problem that, you need a purpose more than anything is that there's a way to misread that, or I think, or a way to think about that not as deeply as one could, which is you do need a purpose, and you need to find a purpose. But that purpose has to be grounded in something enduring and permanent and meaningful. In other words, you can't just willy-nilly select a purpose. It's not like a buffet where you can choose the fried chicken or the cheese, grilled cheese. There has to be something there that justifies that choice, that legitimizes that choice. So for some people, reason is going to be their guide to that purpose. I'm going to choose a rational purpose. For some people, God is going to be their guide to that purpose. I'm going to choose a divine purpose. Those are things, just those two alternatives are both really powerful. That I'm going to live a life of reason, or I'm going to live a life of God, or I'm going to live a life according to these values and virtues. So you need to be sure that the purpose that you choose can be justified and legitimized with something very large in character, like reason, revelation, or whatever the case may be. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of fashion. This is this is what I'm interested in today, and that's what I'm interested in tomorrow. You should take yourself more seriously than that.
Yeah. Well, that's a huge subject, and that's right. That's good. Okay, so your podcast, you're having great success with that, I presume. It seems like you're working hard to make it happen.
Yeah.
And I wonder kind of what has surprised you about jumping into that sphere.
Well, it's a great show. It's I decided that I wanted to talk to other men, and eventually we might branch out to women too. But for now, other men about a book that has changed their life. That's the premise of the show. Come on and tell me about a book that changed your life. Not your favorite book, even. It's not necessarily your favorite, because a lot of people's favorite book, they love it, they love to read it, but it's not the one that really challenged them. And this one might not be your favorite book, but it did change your life. So maybe you were going through a divorce, or maybe you lacked purpose, as we've said, or maybe you were having a hard time otherwise, medical. Maybe your mom died. Maybe you found a book, whatever it was, that put things in perspective for you, or called you to become something different than you were. So that's the premise of the show. And I think, the most immediate thing that surprised me is I let the guests choose the books, and the books that come to me it's unpredictable. And it can be anything from children's literature to nonfiction to a 600-page novel. And just so the wide range of books that can affect a life, and the stories that go with them. Because I ask them, where were you when you found this book? And what were you feeling when you found it? And the first time you read it, what did you think? And tell me the story about how the book affected you in your life once you were finished with it. And then did you return to it 10 years later and read it? And if you did, how did it look different? And so those kinds of things, those stories always surprise me. I think the other part about this podcast is that I read the books that we do. Like, I read the books. And so in a weird way, what's happened to me is that I have read all of the books that have changed everybody else's life, and they now have an effect on me. And so I become this person who's full of these books that have changed other people's life. And that's been a real benefit to me. And this goes back to what I said a little while ago. You need to be the thing that you're telling other people to be. And so if I'm telling other people to read books because they can enrich your life, this podcast I'm doing it. I just read 2,000 pages the past 2 weeks to go film a few episodes. And so that's been the most rewarding thing for me, and some of the surprises that have come my way.
What are your best, how do you hold the discipline of reading? How are you successful in that? I mean, it sounds like you maybe had a couple of week period that was maybe more intense than normal.
Real intense.
But on an ongoing basis, sort of what's your rhythm that's most successful in reading?
One of the things I do, I believe, moderation in all things. And so I look at a book, and if I've got a book to read in front of me, I'll say, all right, how many pages is this? How many chapters is this? How many days do I want to get it done in? And I will split it into even parts, such that I know before I go to bed tonight, this is just recent, I've got to read 8 chapters a day of Catch 22. It's just got to happen. And I'll hold myself to it. And so it takes some discipline. You don't want to overdo it. You can, because then you kind of binge and purge, and you get to the point where you never want to look at a book again because you just read so much at one time. Think of a student who's just taking their last final exam in a summer break. I don't want to be in that situation. And so I try to pace myself out. I set aside time in the morning, time in the evening when I know that I'll have some quiet time. I carry a physical book with me to the dentist's office, to the doctor's office, because you can find little pockets of 10 pages, in your day. I try anytime that you think that you need to check your email or pick up your phone. If you for a week had a small paperback book with you and just tried it, I'm not saying it's going to work for everybody, but just try picking up that book instead. That's a good way to go. So those are some of the things that I have. And one of the things I like to say to people is don't be too precious about it. A lot of people think, well, in order to read, I have to have my chamomile tea, and I got to be in my favorite chair, and it's got to be this kind of lighting, and I got to have a candle. You're never going to, when does that happen in your life? That's, what is that? Once a month? No. You're on the subway. You're on hold for the insurance company. Like you gotta be real about this.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's great. Well, I want to get you to share a little bit of detail about the George W. Bush Presidential Center. But before we do that, I want to ask you: is any of your work is it patriotic for you? Is there a connection in your mind between your work as a professor leading this center, the love of books and liberal arts, and sort of the the fabric of the nation? Do you put those parts together in your mind?
I do, for the following reason. America is unique, a unique experiment in many ways, but this sense was the one that sticks most with me as an educator. We're a nation that exists on the basis of the promise that self-government is possible. Self-government. That if we are to be our own governors, then that means that each of us in his and her own way must, in a certain sense, be a legislator to themselves, a politician, a statesman, whatever the case may be. What self-government requires more than anything else, and we could use the word citizenship in this particular case as a synonym for self-government, but I think self-government is more basic. Self-government requires wise citizens who know the difference between right and wrong, good and bad for the state or the city in the Greek sense. And so as an educator, I see myself when I talk about liberal education and freeing the mind and these kinds of things as cultivating, shaping minds which are free enough, robust enough, and rich enough to engage in the supreme responsibility of self-government. Because if you're not going to have somebody smarter than you do it, if you think the king is not smarter than you, or the Führer is not smarter than you, then that means you got to do it. And that means that you, in a way, have to be your own sovereign. And that requires you to be as knowledgeable as you possibly can, given the other, things that impinge on your life, to govern, to think, to look at laws and representatives and say, those are good, those are bad. I want this one, not that one. And the reasons why are reasons. They're not just prejudices. They're not just, thoughts that I had, fleeting, but I've thought about this and I've looked at the alternative and I've weighed them and this one's better. And so when I think about the connection between liberal education and patriotism in America, I think what we do as educators is foundational to the very possibility of the perpetuation of a great experiment like the United States.
Very beautifully stated. Well, tell us a little bit about the center. What's going on at the George W. Bush Presidential Center? What are you most excited about there? What should we come see?
Yeah, I mean, this place is remarkable. I was never going to leave Princeton in my life. I mean, who wants to leave a great institution with amazing students? When I got to the Bush Center, I could tell, that this place is special. So, we are a presidential library on the campus of a great ACC university, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, a dynamic city. Dallas is growing. It's a business capital. It's just amazing. And, the Bush Center is a place where we're unlike other presidential centers. My goal here is to revolutionize and reinvent the model of what a presidential library can be. For many years, these places have been, and they're good, and I love going to them because I'm a historian, but sort of repository for the legacy of the president. We should be that, and I admire President Bush a great deal. But there are enduring principles for which he stood. Freedom, we talk about opportunity, accountability, compassion, those kinds of things. Those are enduring American principles that he would be the first to say don't belong to him. They belong to all of us. And the question is, how are those principles going to be sustained? And that is what we want to do at the Bush Center. We have an extraordinary institute called the Bush Institute that does work. We've got fellows and scholars who write research papers the way that an institute in Washington, D.C. would on issues of interest to us, from education to immigration, talking to folks in Washington. We do events for the public where I'm interviewing Ken Burns soon on stage, Walter Isaacson soon on stage. We do those great public convening spaces. We have, of course, the Museum of President Bush's time in office, very moving. The 9/11 exhibit in particular is something that I think everybody should come see. The other thing that we're going to do is that we're building a curricular program with SMU so that undergraduates have reason to come inside our walls, take courses with me and other faculty, so that they can study what I call principled leadership, statesmanship, the kind of leadership of a Lincoln, of a Washington, of a Winston Churchill, a person who has a set of principles. You may disagree with them, you may agree with them, but they have a set of principles, and they govern transparently on the basis of what they think is right, and they do their best to stick to that. And I think at the Bush Center, those kinds of things matter a lot to us. They matter a lot to President Bush. And when we think about ourselves, we think about us not as an institution that's about the past. Certainly President Bush's presidency will always have a place here, but to his great credit, he wants this and I want this to be a place about the future. How can we make America better? What can we do to expose new generations to enduring American principles, founding documents, and that kind of thing? So those are the things we do at the Bush Center. If you're ever in Dallas, I encourage folks to come visit us. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary facility.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I love how you're bringing that place to life and making it a place that's about the future as much as anything. And that's really exciting, Shilo. That's all great stuff. All right, in a second here, I'll ask you to go through a little short answer round with me before we close. But I want to ask you, and you may not want to comment on this. I think I understand that you're working on a book on the topic of noble ambition.
Yeah.
Fascinating. We had a house guest last night. I was talking about this upcoming interview and that topic, and man, we just kind of had a long conversation about what that might mean. So I'm curious, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is based off a course that I mentioned a moment ago that I've been teaching. I taught it at Princeton for a while, but I've been teaching it for a long time. 12 years or so. And I use that term. I'm not necessarily wedded to that term, but that's a big theme in the course, what I call noble ambition. And what that would mean is that there are lots of ambitions that folks have, especially young people. And as well as I do, and it's one of the best things about being a teacher and being around young people, is that they're in that stage of life where they are ambitious. The world is open to them. And one of the things that sort of dispirited me, especially teaching in the Ivy League, but even is that students are sort of hyper-focused on money. I want you to have money. I'm not trying to get on anybody's, money. You certainly need to support your family. But that can't be all that you're about. On your tombstone, it can't say Sarah or Johnny made a lot of money. Like, if that's on your tombstone, we got a problem. And so I want to encourage people to think about an ambition of noble purpose. That is to say, an ambition which sees itself as accomplishing something that's just, something that's honorable, something that's decent, and that those sorts of ambitions are arguably more rewarding when they're fulfilled than the ambitions to have status or to have money. Because what I see a lot, and you see this just in our popular culture, I mean, open the front page of a newspaper on any given day, is that you have people of great ambition whose ambition really goes sideways. They were really ambitious, and then they became movie stars, and then they got addicted to drugs, and then they got, and whatever, and it went off the rails. Or they got into politics, and then they got corrupt, and then they got arrested, and now they're in jail. Then they got, I mean, there's so many celebrities, so many political people. I don't even need to name names. You know that it happens all the time. Ambition will mislead you. Ambition will estrange you from your values. Ambition will, if not properly moderated, if not properly tempered, if not properly guided, lead you astray. And so in the class that I teach, there's an author, and this will bring us back to the classics, who was the only other student of Socrates to write something other than Plato. Plato, of course, wrote the great dialogues that we know and that I know are taught in your school. But there's a man named Xenophon. Xenophon was a student of Socrates who wrote history and philosophy, but he was himself an ambitious political man. He was a general of 10,000 Greeks, mercenaries who he led into Persia and then led out of Persia once their mission went awry. But in addition to being a man of great politics, a man of extraordinary success, he was a Socratic. He wrote a book on Socrates called the Memorabilia. He wrote a symposium, as Plato has written a symposium. The book we read in my class is a book called The Education of Cyrus. In Greek, it'd be called the Cyropaideia or Chiropaideia. And it's about Cyrus the Great, the greatest, most ambitious political man ever. And it's Xenophon walking you through the life of Cyrus and giving you an education based on his ambition. And so what I'd like to do is take that Xenophontic, this great, successful political philosophic man, take the writings that he has for ambitious people, modernize them, and make Xenophon a teacher of our own ambition, such that we might be more likely to find through him, to take him as our guide and find through him an ambition of noble purpose. And this is how I read great books. Those people are teachers. This goes back to what we said earlier. Your teachers will return next year. He's not just somebody I read as an academic object. He has taught me. The reason I sit in an office as a CEO is because I had a teacher of leadership. And so I'd like to share that message with other people.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome, Shilo. All right, let's jump into the short answer round here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Love to.
Tell us about a specific teacher that's had a significant positive influence in your life.
Yeah, that's good. The teacher who stands out most in my mind is a teacher I met as an undergraduate. And he was a man, he's still at St. John's. And again, I came to St. John's from the kind of background I told you about. And he's a guy who I would see on the quad talking to students about Socrates as though he were Socrates. Like he'd just walk up to you and say, "What do you think about this?" You were just sitting there minding your own business. He's like a gadfly at St. John's. I'd also see him exercising in the gym. And I came from Texas where you go to the gym because you're going to run track and play football. I didn't think guys who read went and lifted as much weight as I saw him lifting in the gym. And so, we would talk, and he would talk to me about books, and he would take me aside, and we would do reading groups, and, we would talk about ancient Greek, and I was learning ancient Greek at that time. And so he was a teacher who modeled for me what it meant to have a life of the mind, but also to be a strong man.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Outside of your work and your intellectual pursuits and fatherhood and marriage, do you have hobbies that you enjoy?
Well, I just mentioned one of them. I'm a big exerciser. I mean, I just love to push my body, to its limits. I'm now a little older, so I kind of have slowed down. On that. I don't consider this. I mean, you can say it's part of my job, but I've never seen it that way. And that is, I love writing. And I don't just love writing like emails. I love the written word and what it can be. And so when I read the writing, it's been this way my whole life. When I read the writing of somebody like F. Scott Fitzgerald, or even Nietzsche, I wish, and I would love, Cormac McCarthy, I would love to be able to craft a sentence like them. And so much of my life is spent thinking about the way that a finite number of words, all of them exist in the dictionary, which is a thick book, but they're all in there. That number of words can be put together in an infinite number of combinations to move the human heart. And so my hobby really is the craftsmanship of, unlike most academics, the real craftsmanship of the word.
Yeah, great. Beautiful. You've touched on this a little bit, but sort of in this age of distraction, and I'm mainly referring to all of the digital media out there that are drawing our attention. How are you doing with this, and how do you manage and keep your mind on the best things?
So I think I do pretty well with it. I think, again, I learn everything I learned from the great books. And there was a point in my life. So I'm of the generation of the Mark Zuckerbergs. In other words, he and I are close to the same age, and the Jack Dorseys and the tech founders who were on that first big wave. And I remember when Facebook came to my dormitory at St. John's College in around 2004 or 5. This is when only college students could get on, and it was a limited number of colleges. We were reading at that time Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And we were reading his first discourse, and in there, he talks a lot about vanity, and amour propre is what the French would call it, and just wanting to see yourself. And so I looked at those things pretty early on, social media, Instagram, pictures of yourself all over the internet and all this, trying to get status in that way as something that was inherently corrupting, because Rousseau had pointed out that this is like a corruption of man. Like even mirrors for Rousseau, you look at yourself in the mirror, you become concerned with your own appearance, you start to look at your hair, you start to adorn yourself with jewelry, and then it's off to the races. The purity of savage man has been lost. So for me, there was always a kind of questionable moral, like, would I still be a person of substance? Where do I engage in that? So that was the first part. The second part of the way I avoid it is that I don't keep any of that stuff on my phone. I pick up a book when I'm tempted to pick up and look at my email. I choose the sources that I consume media from. Like I read 2 or 3 newspapers. I listen to 2 or 3 podcasts, and that's about the size of it. And so I think, you have to moderate yourself, set yourself limits, and realize that a lot of this stuff is manipulation, addiction, superficiality, vanity, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's very wise. Turning to parents, some of our parents who may be watching this, what advice would you give to parents in the raising of strong or resilient high school graduates, presumably headed on to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, well, they've already, if they're parents that have students at your school, in my view, they've already taken a good first step. I mean, I think, submitting students to rigorous education, which challenges their convictions, as I've said, is the first step. I think beyond that, though, I think, students need to engage, young people in particular, to be resilient and strong, need to engage in some kind of adventuring. I have in mind, I love Winston Churchill's book, My Early Life. Mm-hmm. And, he escapes from prison in the Boer War, and he's very young at this time, and he goes on this extraordinary adventure across Africa. I mean, it's really amazing. And I think about the adventures of young people, like, our young people don't really do that. I mean, we live in a kind of safety culture where you got to call mom and they're going to have the little tracker on you, like the Apple thing that you can track your kids with and all that. Right. Churchill didn't have a tracker when he was in the Boer, you know what I mean? No. And so I just feel like to look at your child and say, especially because you said high school, you are basically an adult. Like we did it, especially if you're a senior. I mean, you can fight in the military and vote. I'm going to let go and I'm going to trust you. And I want you to put yourself in some situation, whether it's you take a trip, you get a job here in town, whatever it is, where you subject yourself to something that you're just not sure you can accomplish. You don't know that you can. And I don't mean taking a test or sitting in front of a computer. I mean out in the world, the way Churchill just wasn't sure if he was going to get home. The way Odysseus just wasn't sure if he was going to make it back. It doesn't have to be on that scale. That's why I say you can get a job in your hometown, you can join an organization, whatever it may be. It's a physical challenge, but you need to encourage your kids to subject themselves to things that they're not sure they can finish and you're not sure they can finish. And then don't hover over them and just see what happens.
Yeah. Great. I love it. I've got one in college, one who's a senior in high school, and another in 10th grade. And all of those things resonate with me very much. So that is right on. That's awesome. All right, let's give some advice to aspiring teachers. Maybe they're in college or graduate school. What advice would you give to a teacher in terms of their own education to prepare to be a teacher, prepare to become a teacher, and what should they look for in the schools that they may consider working with?
Wow. I mean, I feel like me giving advice to K-12 teachers on that, they should be advising me. I mean, that's a hard question. I can only say what I look for. And again, I was going to teach at the university level, but when I teach students, it's to use a Platonic term, a Socratic term, it is a exercise, and it's out of fashion. It's going to sound weird when I say it, but let me explain it. It's an exercise in seduction. And what I mean there is the way Socrates would catch the attention of an interlocutor because he had said something about virtue, justice, that was like, I've never heard that before. And this guy's a little crazy. Tell me more. You need to be able to seduce students to learning, such that it's exciting, such that, remember they're young, it feels almost rebellious. This has been very, very successful for me. And by the way, I learned it from the best, and his name was Socrates. That it feels almost rebellious, that it feels almost, I used to tell my students, now this is at the university, and parents who are listening to this know that this is a bit of an exaggeration. I would say, if you don't go home from your first semester of college and your parents don't want to kill me, then I have failed you, because Socrates got killed for all the stuff that he said. And he was the educator, the model in the West. So again, parents, I don't think you need to want to kill the teacher, but this is a message to teachers to say, you need to challenge your students such that they feel like, man, is this good? Is this okay? Should we be talking about it? Like, that's what these great books can do. They're deep. And so for teachers, find a set of questions that endure throughout a variety of the literature of whatever discipline you teach, whether it's mathematics, whether it's music, whether it's literature, whether it's philosophy, that are so enticing to you that when you talk about them to students, they're enticed by that. And I think when you look for a school, I mean, the way I choose universities, I can't say K-12, is that there's a lot of different missions for a lot of different universities. I'm looking for a university, and you might look for a K-12 school that understands what the formation of the soul means, that character education is a part of an education, that yes, our students must be people who get jobs. Yes, our students must be competent in X, Y, and Z discipline, but they also have to be people who live happy lives, or else they're going to be miserable. And so I think, trying to suss out both the quality of the academic things that are measurable of the education is really important, but there's a thing that's not tangible, that has to do with the human soul and human character, cultivation and formation. That kind of thing has always been to me a mark of a school I'd want to be associated with.
Yeah. Well, Shilo, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me today. I'm certain that our audience is going to love hearing from you. And, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is, to make friends with people like you around the country who are doing great work and we feel a kinship towards. And so I hope that we'll have opportunities to stay in contact and support one another's work, because I think you're doing great things out there. And it's been really fun to watch your podcast, listen to your podcast, and see you have so much success with that. And so thanks again for your time.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all your staff and your teachers and your parents. It's an extraordinary enterprise y'all are engaged in.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, folks, that's the show for today. I'm Matthew Kirby, CEO of Liberty Classical Schools. I hope this conversation with Dr. Shilo Brooks will encourage you to learn more about him and also about us. And you can do that at libertyclassicalschools.org. Dr. Brooks, where can people read more about you?
So you can find old school video format on YouTube, audio format. This is my podcast on Apple and Spotify. You can come to the Bush Center. You can come to our website, see more about all the work that we do. And then I write for the popular press. Just Google me, and hopefully 2027, sometime 28, I don't know, my book that we've been discussing will be out.
That's awesome. All right. Thanks. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time.